Writing for interactive environments is a class looking at the traditional story structure and then discussing also how it takes place in games, drawing analogies to film and other popular media. But the really important point about the class, the one I'm trying to bring across to the students, is that when you're writing for an interactive environment, you have broken down and shattered the traditional model of storyteller, receiver of the story, and the serial linear narrative. And once you've broken that model, there's a tremendous amount of possibility that comes into that place, but also the job of a writer gets much, much harder. And so the video game is a very strange medium to tell stories in, because it's one that's totally riddled and fixed with these abstract and bizarre rule sets. You have things which make no sense at all. You have a monster you kill in the woods and it drops a golden bracelet. What was it doing with the golden bracelet? We really don't know. It's never explained. Bears drop diamonds out of their asses when you kill them. Nobody's explained these things. Who cares? We've learned to accept it because we play these games that are full of these crazy mechanics. We accept them because we buy into the worlds. We buy into the worlds because the worlds are grounded in stories. If the stories are good stories, like the ones that Blizzard knows how to tell or BioWare knows how to tell, then we will accept the absurdity of the mechanics. But the storyteller's job is still very hard. We have to take these traditional arcs and traditional narratives, the hero's journey, the 3-act model, and we have to squeeze it into these spaces with these ridiculous rule sets. Now, as the rule sets get more complicated, as the worlds get more photorealistic, the job gets even harder, because then you have the uncanny valley. Then you have things like, I need to tell a story with this character, and this character looks realer than ever, but the world he lives in is increasingly absurd. He gets to die every 5 minutes and then come back again. But everything looks real, and that doesn't happen in real life. So Bungie's a good example. Bungie, with the Master Chief in Halo, wrote a character who had no name and put him in a carbon freeze with the suggestion that there are many of him, there are clones. So they wrote into their storyline the fact that you die in the game every 5 minutes and magically reappear at this checkpoint. Like they've already grasped that as we get towards visual realism, we have to get towards story realism also. And these are parallel to one another. We draw on the same mythologies again and again. We draw on the hero's role. We draw on the role of the underdog coming up from anywhere, from nowhere, from just some guy blows into town and suddenly ends up rescuing the place. And so it's the same stories. It's the same stories. We have different mediums, but we still pull back to the same campfire story. So we start off with the idea of the campfire story, where the storyteller is there and the people listening to the story are there and they interact. He doesn't do a serial linear narrative. He takes off on a tangent when somebody else asks a question. And that was the Colossal Cave model. But if you look at the Colossal Cave model in those early games, they're incredibly rigid structures. If I don't get the lamp at the right time, if I don't find the fuel for the lamp is useless. If I don't light the lamp, I'm never going to make it down that hallway. Very rigid structures. Like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I make all the students play that game. And if they can't beat the Babelfish puzzle, which everybody who's played that one knows what I'm talking about, if they can't beat that one, they get a C in that assignment. But I want to show them that those games used to be crazy rigid and very strict and punitive. Every mistake was punished with death. And we've outgrown that model a little bit. And now I think we have more freedom to tell better stories. But the medium's watered down. So our first things we do in that class is we work on what are good characters, and then what are good settings for stories, and then how those interact with one another. And then we talk about things like puzzle structures. What's a good puzzle? What's a good riddle? What are some historical models for that, and what are some mythological models for that? But mostly we talk a lot about what people are interested in interactive space. Like, I think one of the things that's fascinating about the massive multiplayer is that they bifurcate rapidly into different varieties of consumers. You've got the very rare person who wants to genuinely role play. The people who are so committed to that world that they will get married in that world, that they will choose to be a paladin and act like a real paladin. And then you have people that are interested in only the game mechanics, they want to power level up. And then you have people who show up and they say, where are the girls at? You know, who want a sex chat and hang out in the auction house. But those different levels of discourse are like the levels of commitment to television or film. Like we have people who go see the serious art house. I'm only going to see merchant ivory films. Then we have people who want to just read comic books and hang out. And so the class itself splits up into that. We have students who are interested in doing, I'm writing the next Final Fantasy. This is an epic 80-hour story. You will not be able to tear your eyes away from my awesome story. And we have the guys who are like, well, let's do a fun humor puff piece. And that's part of the fun of the class too, is to see how those things split apart. But no, I think part of it I also do just to preserve that medium, the early days of the text adventure, to get them exposed to that. Because the students today have no exposure to that whatsoever, except for strong bad parodies. And the parodies on homestarrunner.com. They have no exposure to that at all. And so when I get them playing Hitchhiker's Guide and Colossal Cave and Beneath the Steel Sky, which is the adventure game we play, it's one of my absolute favorites. To them, it's silly and childish and primitive. And it still kicks their ass. They can't get past it. How do I solve this puzzle? I'm like, well, just look at it. Pay attention to it. All the clues are there. But that's interesting for them too, because they start to realize that there's a whole structure underneath the game mechanics, tremendous possibilities to tell stories. And then they start to get frustrated. They start to get frustrated about how bad the stories are in games, because there's so much possibility for good writing, and we censor ourselves or we cut ourselves off, or the writer gets hired 5 minutes before the game ships just to wrap a bow around it before it ships. But then they also get very nostalgic, like, oh, I remember playing Chrono Trigger and I cried when this character died and this sort of thing. And they start to realize that there is a really important thing in games, which is the writing and the characters, and that it stays with you longer than the mechanics of it. I don't particularly remember what spell I used to kill this particular boss monster, but I remember killing him. And so if they have a lyrical voice and have a writerly voice when they approach game design, that can't possibly hurt. I don't know. I went to a conference at GDC, and they had a bunch of guys who were Hollywood hired guns. And they gave a big long talk about how they were Hollywood hired guns, and they're getting hired by the game industry to write cool stories. And one of the guys was a scriptwriter for RoboCop 3 or something like that. One of the guys was he'd done 20 episodes of Star Trek. It's like, yeah, we're the Hollywood guys. We're getting hired now to write your games because we're Hollywood. We know how to write things. And then they went for 40 minutes, and they gave the strongest argument I've ever heard in my entire life for not hiring a Hollywood guy to write your game, because they just didn't grasp it. They were still nailed down to the serial 90-minute linear narrative. Like 15 minutes in, introduce the second character. 25 minutes in, introduce the ingenue. 35 minutes in, first explosion. Like the Joe Esterhaus, model of filmmaking. They were still wedded to that. They still were convinced that games were action movies and nothing else. And I find that incredibly disappointing. Like, I want people to appreciate games as a writing medium. But the other thing is, like, what do we do with the FedEx puzzle? The FedEx quest. Kill this person, fetch their head, bring them back here. That's the core structure of almost all RPGs, first-person shooters, like the FedEx quest, the assassination. Like, we've had these models, these gameplay mechanics, and we try to dress them up with storyline. But when it comes back to it, it's still the red key for the red door. So, what do we do? What's next? When they actually start writing interactive things, and they also like to write choose-your-own adventure books, we do some of those too, then they start to have thinking about the implications of showing two sides of a character, or showing more than one line of thinking, or the horrible trap you get yourself in once you start forking off and branching. How do I close my branch back in again? How do I find my bottleneck in order to bring the story back down? We spent a lot of time talking about also why we end up remaking essentially Die Hard as a paradigm action film. Why we remake that movie again and again. The one-man army as a core game design, which does not go away. Everybody wants to be the underdog who takes on an entire island full of bad guys with only a pistol and a knife. Those aren't great storytelling spaces. You really can't tell a lot of story in that environment. But that's a great guaranteed moneymaker for the industry, and so they're going to keep going back to that well again and again. But what kind of stories can we tell? What kind of cool stuff can we do? I showed them this piece of software called Facade, which I'm sure the academic community is familiar with by now. It's a really uncomfortable thing to be in that game, because the characters don't have health bars. They don't have indicators. They don't have an interface. They don't have an exclamation point over their head to tell you that they have a question or a statement for you. And so in Facade, the two characters who are having the argument and you're interacting with them in that three-dimensional space, all the traditional game mechanics that we rely upon are stripped away. And suddenly you find yourself in this very awkward space. Like, I don't have my progress bar. I don't have my score. How do I measure myself? And so typically the reaction is, quit. Or did I win? Did I lose? And so that's a great example for the students to show them that the game mechanics intrude on the storytelling space, that there's a war. And so we do a lot of things like exercises like, write a character, but write him 4 different ways. Show me him from the perspective of his father. Show me him from the perspective of his friend who hates him now because they had an altercation in the past. And so, but I don't know, it's funny too, like the Choose Your Own Adventure books my students make are typically very violent and almost always fantasy. I've had one sci-fi one turned in. So they tend to veer heavily towards fantasy. And they're almost always about the good old-fashioned quest. Let's get the ring. The ring will help us blast the Gorgon. The Gorgon will die. We'll get out of the cave. We win. And so they're making, adventure fiction 101, which is fine. That's what the class is about. But I did get one a couple of semesters ago about a girl with a drug problem. And it was about, you were a person who had a girl who was your friend but not your girlfriend. And you had to rescue her from her drug problem. And you had to fend off her dealer who was trying to call her and get her to buy another batch. And you also had to fend off her parents who wanted to grab her away and take her to a rehab center, intervention style. And you also had to keep her from just, dying, ODing. And I thought that was an incredible space to tell a story in an interactive fashion, because it's really hard to get outside the fantasy and the sci-fi. It's really hard to escape that trap that the industry has put itself in. And so it had 2 branches to it, where you could supply her with drugs yourself to keep her basically sane, because she was telling you that, I'm going to die, I'm going to go insane, I'm going to throw myself out the window if you don't get me some heroin right now. And so you could actually give her the heroin, or you could say no and lock the door. And the way he branched it off is if you gave her the heroin, which seemed to be the only logical choice, because it's that or she kills herself. And that seems like a dead end of the story. He gave you a false choice, and you ended up with the parents intervention coming in. Or you ended up with another choice, which you basically have to lock the door or keep her held down. And then she tells another part of the story, which gives you a clue, which helps you solve a couple of the puzzles. But the fascinating thing was the ending of it. He gave you 3 endings to it. And there was really no relationship between them. The 3 endings were quite distinct and different from one another. And they drew straight from a sentence that she said in the very beginning. And so I thought it was a nice way to close that circle in like 14 pages. It was a really nice piece, and I really appreciated the effort he put into it. But it also is a tremendous example of the interactive space split off from the horrible game mechanics that we've wedded ourselves to. Another example I always give students is the snake puzzle in Colossal Cave, as an example of a cool story space and the absurdity that we put our gamers through. like that one makes no sense to me. Like, I figured that one out by accident. I just stumbled across it. Like, who would have thought of attacking the snake with a bird as solving that puzzle? I understand why they did it that way, because you got to have mechanics. You got to have things that like gate and bar things off to impede my progress, and so I can earn my passage through. But the stumble on puzzle, it's still something we do all the time. To me, the stumble on puzzle, like I just sort of figure out the solution by randomly poking things. It's like the horror movie where somebody pops out of the closet. It's just kind of we've done that. But it's really useful. And so they use it a lot in their stories. They use stumble on puzzle a lot. With Ultima 4, Richard Garriott was trying to tell a story that had a moral imperative. That the avatar's role was not, I'm a generic hero in a generic world doing something. He was literally the savior of the world. And he didn't have to just kill things. He had to go off into the wilderness and meditate. He had to pray. He had to act out and embody his virtues. If you'd earned the rune of compassion, and then you killed a helpless person, you would lose the rune of compassion. You had to go back through the entire process of earning that rune again. So he made the commitment with Ultima 4 to tell a story and to back it up with game mechanics in a way that was very hardcore, in a way that was very punitive. You could make a mistake in Ultima 4 and wipe yourself of all your runes and have to start all over again. And getting the actual runes themselves is incredibly tedious. Like you had to sit in a shrine and chant this thing over and over again. But that was a huge commitment. The guys at Cyan, when they decided to make Myst, committed to telling a story which had multiple characters and multiple points of view in a space which nobody had really explored before. The graphical adventure had been around for quite some time, perfected, of course, by LucasArts and Sierra. But I've had students complain that Myst doesn't have any writing in it. They're like, oh, LucasArts stuff was better. You know, it had more writing, it was funnier. Like, Myst is all writing. The library is the core of the entire game. And Aknar and all the other characters, you get to see both sides of the issue, which is something so rare. And so it's like, that sort of deep committed storytelling is, I think, what drives like the core of game design. Bill Heinemann wrote The Bard's Tale, the engine of it. And I talked to him about The Bard's Tale. He said The Bard's Tale and Wasteland, the other games he worked on, were just, he said they were fan fiction. Like he was trying to be as cool and as awesome as Tolkien and the fantasy authors that he read and Michael Moorcock and the Torah books. And like he was his fan fiction, he was trying to imitate the masters. And the medium of computer games was sort of his shortcut. But no, I think the writing and the quality of the writing for that time period, like so many great games from that little chunk of time, while the arcade industry was crashing and the console industry was almost non-existent, then at that time we had the King's Quest series, we had the Space Quest series, we had Ultima 4, Ultima 5, we had the Bard's Tale 2, we had the Sierra Adventures, we had the tail end of the Infocom Adventures before we switched over to truly graphical adventures, and the genius of LucasArts, Sam and Max, and like that huge blossoming until the consoles came back, until the PlayStation sort of, you know, took gaming back to the consoles. That little beautiful period on the PC was also maybe a mini renaissance of some sort. But it also sort of set the stage for, if you look at games before that crash and after the crash, you can see that the story is what saved games. Like that the arcade was dead because the arcade didn't have any story to tell. If I play Asteroids, I'm never going to learn anything new. I will always be a ship with some rocks. And that's basically it. I was taught in undergraduate school and in graduate school that the finest novel ever written was Heart of Darkness. And the best writer ever was Shakespeare, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's very classical as a canon story, a Harold Bloom perspective on the world. And to look back at just 4 or 5 years at the way I was being taught, and to look at the way I'm teaching these students now, you feel that gulf between, I don't want to say the people who don't get it, but the people that, there's a generational gap and there's a turf war. There's a very clear pull from the ivory tower that, like, this is the one way to tell stories. Don't tell stories any other way. This is not a legitimate medium to tell stories in. And then there's also my students who don't see a separation. For them, the hard argument is getting them to read a book. For them, the real challenge is getting them to actually sit down and read a serial, linear, closed narrative. For them, reading is a chore. And that I find that it's funny. I find myself both ways. I'm like, that's heartbreaking that they think that reading is a dead thing. But at the same time, they're writing for a world where they're going to have to craft these broken up, chopped up, sliced and diced narratives for different mediums, and they're going to have to learn to adapt and write in that space. But I also make them play Adventure and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because they have to see the sparseness of just the raw text. Like, just use your imagination. That's it. That's all you've got. And the richness of the writing for those is fantastic. Like, Adventure is a good example of how you can tell a great story with very few words. Because the constraints of the technology and the constraints of the space, how little writing can you do to give somebody a sense that they're in a room with a candle, and there's a rusty iron gate, fill in the blanks. Or Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is almost like a word explosion. It's that Douglas Adams verbosity, which is almost overwhelming. Like the Babelfish puzzle was so challenging, not just because you have to beat it mechanically, but because every time you make a mistake, the response you get is so sarcastic that you have to sort of puzzle through the sarcasm and figure out what you actually did wrong. But yeah, Beneath the Steel Sky in particular is just, it's a little indie game. There's one guy who does all the voices, which you can tell because he tries different accents. He tries a Scottish accent and an Irish accent to try to disguise the fact that it's all the same voice actor. But it just has fun puzzles. And they're based on some logic and some not logic. And but the companion robot is really what sold me on Beneath the Steel Sky. They love the stories in games. They love that. They want to see that happen more, and they want to write for games. We have students who want to graduate from the school. What do you want to do? I want to be a game writer. Breaking it to them that's not necessarily a real occupation you can just jump into is a little hard sometimes.